In this video, I'm gonna talk about Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis. If EA is the megabyte of video game companies, then Sega is its hexadecimal. All of their business decisions are driven by chaos theory, and it serves to keep their immense potential power in check. If you roll 20, they give you unforgettable gems like Jet Set Radio, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and the entire Yakuza franchise. If you roll 1, they follow up the groundbreaking success of Phantasy Star Online with questionable updates before they just go on and restrict the sequel to Japanese players only. It took years of complaints and questions before Sega figured out that there might just be a fan base all across the globe consisting of, I don't fucking know, the entire player base of the original game, before they actually deigned to grace us with an international release. On the Windows Store, which has a non-negligible chance of spontaneously deleting itself. By the time they actually do this, it does not even matter, because everyone has already moved to the updated release of Final Fantasy XIV that came out 7 years ago. The international release of PSO2 Classic was dripping with Japanese design and Japanese problems without the usual filter that makes the Yakuza franchise adorable. Years of constant updates for the Japanese player base got dumped wholesale onto the international market, with your only instructions being sink or swim. If it was at this point that you chose to finally get PSO2, then you were not the target audience. The target audience was the no longer negligible mass of international players who had been there from the start and who had used every trick in the book to masquerade as Japanese citizens so they could play. The international release came with two important points. One, there was an unspoken expectation that the seasoned players would introduce their friends to the game. Two, there was a question that Sega wanted the answer to, and it was, will the potential players we believe exist actually follow through and play the game? I gave it a shot since the base game was free, and I was confronted with manuals and reference guide the size of cinder blocks. You could be a couple hours into the game and you would be getting information about item crafting, summoning pets, cooking food, playing the casino, some other minigame I do not remember, side quests that nobody tells you come from an infinite supply, and all of this while a siren blares all over regarding some emergency mission that will have you fight what looks like an end boss in a battle so frantic that you are convinced that you spent all of it ragdolling. The illegitimate international players got the luxury of digesting the content piecewise, so they do not have an understanding of what a new legitimate player gets bombarded with on day one, and what is obvious to a seasoned player looks like arbitrary bullshit to a newbie who just spent his entire stack of crafting materials on a fruitless project because the game's tutorial suggested he do that. It all gives the impression that I missed an important train somewhere, blended with the impression that I did nothing wrong and yet I still lost. It is like those concert tickets that go on sale, except that they are sold out right from the start, and you learn the hard way that you were supposed to cheat the system to even have a chance of getting one. I need to preamble with all of this because the entire classic experience is included with the base game, and you are at liberty to play it at your leisure. Doing so will pop you right into the starter mission, accompanied by the Aussiest Aussie in the universe, before flooding you with enough tutorial pages to make War and Peace experience penis envy. In its infinite wisdom, Sega rolls the dice again, gets a 5, and decides to make a total conversion with new content and a new development roadmap that will make the experience easier to digest for new players. I am not sure whether they just reused the PSO2 engine, or if they updated or made a new one for New Genesis, but it does not matter because both instances run like shit, and you will have to drop the graphical quality to a laughable level if you want the FPS counter to stop dipping below 60 as soon as something interesting happens. The majority of the combat is a lot more freeform and forgiving than the classic experience, in that the controls are simpler, you move faster, and your options feel more fluid. Dodging is not just a parry mechanic, but also a way to make it so the game does not even attempt to register an attack on you, which is pretty important when fighting the bigger guys. Beyond this, you have food to pick, minerals to mine, and various other crafting materials to temporarily or permanently enhance yourself or your weapons. Since most of the resource locations are fixed, it means that you can make it part of your daily routine to go on a pre-planned collectathon, which can be either relaxing or tedious depending on the mood of the day. Your playground consists of a gigantic open airfield that has been peppered with harmless animals and spooky monsters that get angry if you get too close to them. It is about as typical and traditional as one can imagine in the world of massively multiplayer online, with the one difference that you hold the mouse button over the enemy instead of clicking once and then waiting for the battle to resolve. You have access to a handful of special moves, and their purpose will vary depending on which class you are playing. Most enemies are weak to a particular element, so the main concern of a wizard is whether they need to push the red, the blue, or the yellow button. Gun users can target and weaken specific parts of enemies, and nobody knows what to do when this happens, because nobody expected the gun users to have a working brain cell. Sword users have moves centered around utility, such that your special attacks are not for the sake of damage, so much as they are to readjust your position or strike multiple weaklings at the same time. The most bizarre thing happens with the weak spots, and it is that the noise of a critical hit is less impactful than the one of a standard hit, which is so counterintuitive that all game studios that have made this mistake in the past have gone out of business and are no longer heard of again. I would expect to hear a satisfying crunch, or witness an explosion, or some blood or alien fluid gushing like a fountain when I hit the weak spot, but instead it feels like I am slicing through an overcooked cauliflower, and I spent a moment wondering if I was doing something wrong. Naturally, you need something else to do than wander around the killing fields and hit whatever has the misfortune of standing in your path, which is why storyline characters will give you assignments to kill monster in a specific location instead. You get introduced to a handful of mechanics and some details to look out for, and then the story just stops. You heard me. This is as far as the game gets as of July 2021. You can max out your level and run through all the content in under 50 hours. There is no endgame because it has not been released yet. You got a handful of boss enemies that wander the killing fields, and the strategy for defeating them consists of hitting them until their weak spot shows up, and then you hit the weak spot until you hear the victory chime. You can then spend the rest of the day going back to town, finding a clump of people, hitting the sit emote, and then going AFK. You can also play around with the cosmetic options, the overwhelming majority of which have been thought around a biological human's body. If you are playing a robot, you have my condolences. You have the option of giving your robot a human body, but the end result is about as off as Beyond Meat burgers. I chose to look exactly the same as in PSO1, which is a design born out of an angsty 16-year-old version of myself. I absolutely do not fit into any pictures in this game. I do not even fit entirely in the frame in cutscenes. I am an unspeakable horror, lost in the ocean of barely legal catgirls with giant titties. I am part of the last bastion of warriors, an Iron Lord from an era before everything turned into a dazzling fashion show. I have said before that Destiny 2 was literally Phantasy Star Online, and that is still true. Destiny 2 is more like Phantasy Star Online than Phantasy Star Online 2 is. I remember the original game as being one where you could shut your brain off and act stupid for a couple hours with next to no consequence. You could experiment and challenge yourself and your friends to all sorts of made-up games for the sake of having a good time. That was true only of the first release of the game. Version 2 came in, took the max level to a whopping 200, and introduced Ultimate Difficulty, which was basically a shorthand to say that everything could one-shot you unless you had the very best equipment the game could offer. Subsequent releases included more crowd control and bullshit mechanics, so that endgame enemies felt like fighting 6 copies of Mei from Overwatch. Chaos theory oblige, there was a collectible card game somewhere in the middle, and in the given context, the idea is as ridiculous as how you think it is. The design philosophy of New Genesis imposes that you need to have the latest and most high-level weapon. You need to have chosen the right skills on your skill tree, and you do not have enough points for all of them. You need to have done at least a few of the micro-optimizations. The game is already being picked apart so that players can squeeze every last point of damage potential out of their weapons. We have already fallen into the horrific world of min-maxing. The average boss fight, as it stands now, is perfectly doable by a crayon muncher of my sort, and all I have to my name is a fancy sword and as many raw upgrades as I could put onto the thing. I have no idea how long this will last before I start getting yelled at for using the wrong attack at the wrong time and missed out on 10 points of damage. I only know that it will happen someday, and I am dreading that moment like the apocalypse. I have been looking for the usual unique Sega quirkiness, and I cannot find it. The sci-fi fantasy world has been replaced by generic hexagons. The infamous cake shop is nowhere to be found. The staples of the franchise have all but disappeared, and what remains is a sort of misguided attempt to be part of a greater crowd I did not expect, and with which I am not sure I am on the same wavelength. The beloved addiction that saw me nearly flunk out of high school and gave me the social life I never had has transformed into something I cannot recognize anymore. I fully expect the game to turn to me with an angry look on its face and yell, "This is not a phase, Mom," before it runs out of the house to re-dye its mohawk in a garish color and chase after a liberal arts degree. The body is 8 years older, but the mind has been at a standstill all along. In short, this game is a brony.
Ma gang de malades, vous êtes